There were 4,000 motorcycles in Hollister, California on the 4th of July weekend, 1947. They were spread across a valley town of 4,500 people, a place that had been hosting motorcycle races since the 1930s. The San Benito County Fairgrounds had organized racing that weekend. The Salinas Ramblers held a gymkhana. Riders from across California came for the bikes, for the racing, for the company of people who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere under your own power on a machine you had built yourself. By Monday morning, Life magazine had turned it into a national scandal. One photograph. Staged. A man named Eddie Davenport, not a violent outlaw, but a regular rider, was asked to sit on a borrowed motorcycle surrounded by empty beer bottles that had been collected from the surrounding area and arranged in the frame by a photographer named Barney Peterson. Davenport was paid for his participation. The motorcycle was not his. The beer bottles were collected from a gutter. They were not placed there by Davenport. The caption read, "Motorcyclists Take Over Town." America believed it. Hollywood confirmed it. And the culture that had existed for 40 years before that photograph, the actual motorcycle culture of the 1940s and the 1950s, the veterans and the working men and the women who rode because they loved it, and the clubs that organized racing and safety and community events across the country, that culture was buried under a myth that Hollywood invented, and the industry spent the next 70 years selling back to the people it had destroyed. To understand what the 1950s motorcycle culture actually was, you have to understand what preceded it. And what preceded it was 40 years of working Americans falling in love with the motorcycle as the most democratic machine ever built. The Indian Motorcycle Company was founded in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1901. Harley-Davidson followed in Milwaukee in 1903. By 1910, there were dozens of American motorcycle manufacturers competing for the attention of a public that had discovered a machine that could cover ground faster than a horse, required less maintenance than a car, and could be purchased by a working man who could not yet afford four wheels. By 1920, the American Motorcyclists Association had been established to sanction racing, organize clubs, and build the institutional framework for a culture that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The association's membership through the 1920s and the 1930s was working class in the truest sense of the word. Farmers, factory workers, miners, postal workers, delivery men. Men for whom the motorcycle was not a leisure product, but a practical machine that happened to produce joy in the using of it. Women rode too, before anyone called it remarkable. Effie Hotchkiss rode a motorcycle across America in 1915 from New York to San Francisco and back with her mother in the sidecar. She was 26 years old. She did not have GPS. She did not have paved roads for most of the route. She had a Harley-Davidson, a sidecar, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided to do something and was not interested in the reasons it could not be done. In 1916, Sisters Augusta and Adeline Van Buren became the first women to ride motorcycles across America. The American Motorcyclists Association refused to certify them because the certification was for men only. They went anyway. They arrived on the West Coast and applied to join the Army as dispatch riders. The Army refused. They went home. For the next 40 years, nobody in American popular culture talked about them. The motorcycle community of the 1920s and 1930s was not an outlaw culture. It was a community culture. The AMA organized gypsy tours, group rides to specific destinations that created a social infrastructure around the machine. Local clubs held hill climbs, flat track races, and endurance events. Riders competed for trophies rather than territory. The social events were family events, picnics, barbecues, camping trips, organized around the machine that everyone in the group owned, loved, and maintained. The men who came back from World War II came back different. They had been 18 or 20 when they left, and 30 or 35 when they returned. They had been to places they could not describe and done things they could not talk about. They came home to a country that wanted to pretend the war had not happened the way it had, that wanted normalcy and conformity and the suburban dream as a replacement for the chaos of the preceding decade. Some of them could not do it, not because they were dangerous, but because they had been somewhere that normal life could not reach. The motorcycle was the only piece of equipment available that produced a sensation close to what they were missing: the speed, the exposure to weather and road. The mechanical intimacy of a machine that responded directly to every decision the rider made. The community of other men who had also been somewhere that the civilian world did not fully understand. They formed clubs, the booze fighters, the pissed off bastards of Bloomington, the Market Street Commandos. These names sound menacing to 2026 ears. In 1946, they were ironic, the self-deprecating humor of men who had survived something and needed a name for the group that shared the survival. Most of these clubs were not outlaw organizations. They were veteran organizations that rode motorcycles. The gypsy tours, the hill climbs, the flat track events, the AMA calendar of sanctioned activities. That was the frame most of these clubs operated within, the same frame that had defined American motorcycle culture for 20 years before the war. July 4th weekend, 1947. The Salinas Ramblers Motorcycle Club had organized the AMA sanctioned gypsy tour to Hollister, California. The San Benito County Fairgrounds had racing on the schedule. The town had hosted motorcycle events for years without incident. The numbers vary by source. Roughly 4,000 riders came. A town of 4,500 people suddenly had its population nearly doubled by visitors arriving on motorcycles. Most of them were there for the racing. Some of them were there for the beer. A small number of them were not affiliated with any club and were not interested in the scheduled activities. There were incidents, minor property damage, some public drunkenness, a few fistfights. The Hollister City Jail, which had a capacity of 10, was stretched. The local police were overwhelmed not because the riders were violent, but because 4,000 unexpected visitors to a town of 4,500 produces logistical challenges that no small-town police department had been designed to manage. The San Francisco Chronicle sent a reporter. The reporter sent a dispatch that described events in terms significantly more dramatic than what the Hollister chief of police would later characterize as just one hell of a big party. The Associated Press picked up the story. Life magazine sent Barney Peterson to get a photograph. What Peterson found when he arrived was not a town under siege. It was a party that had gotten loud. The street was littered with beer bottles, the residue of 4,000 people spending a holiday weekend in a small town. There was no organized violence. There were no weapons. There was noise and mess and the specific chaos of a large gathering in a small place that had not been designed for it. Peterson needed a photograph that told the story the wire service had already filed. He found Eddie Davenport, a 29-year-old rider from Riverside who was willing to sit on a borrowed motorcycle. The beer bottles from the surrounding area were collected and arranged around the motorcycle. Davenport was told to look disheveled and hold a beer. Peterson took the photograph. The caption that ran in Life magazine read, "Motorcyclists Take Over Town." The country that had just survived World War II and was deeply anxious about what the returning veterans had brought back with them, looked at that photograph and saw confirmation of its deepest fear. They believed the men who had come home were not entirely civilized. The motorcycle was the vehicle of their UN civilization. The town of Hollister was the first casualty. Every word of that interpretation was wrong. The photograph was staged. The caption was fabricated. The veterans who came to Hollister came for a race, drank beer at a party, and went home. The chief of police said so. The city records said so. Actual contemporary accounts from Hollister residents said so. Nobody was listening. Hollywood was already writing the script. Before we go further, if you are watching this and you know someone who has been riding for 30 years and thinks they know where motorcycle culture came from, send them this video right now. Not later. Right now. The story we are telling about where the outlaw biker myth actually came from has never been told at this depth on YouTube. The person who shares it first is doing the riding community a genuine service. Share it to your Facebook groups. Post it in your motorcycle subreddits. Text it to the riders you know. The history that gets covered up stays covered up until someone decides to share the accurate version. The Wild One, directed by Laszlo Benedek, produced by Stanley Kramer, starring Marlon Brando as Johnny, the leader of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, and Lee Marvin as Chino, the leader of the rival Beatles. The film was released December 30th, 1953. It was based loosely on a short story by Frank Rooney called The Cyclists Raid, which was itself based loosely on the Hollister incident. The distance between what actually happened at Hollister and what appears in The Wild One is the distance between a loud party and a siege. The Wild One was a work of fiction presented as a window into reality. The opening title card set the tone. It read, "This is a shocking story. It could never take place in most American towns, but it did in this one." The film that followed showed motorcycle riders terrorizing a small town, assaulting citizens, holding a woman captive, and generally conducting themselves as an occupying force. The film was condemned by the National Legion of Decency. It was banned in Britain for 14 years. And it became the most culturally influential motorcycle film ever made, because it gave the American public a visual language for the motorcycle rider that was simultaneously frightening and romantic. Brando's performance as Johnny was not that of a villain. It was the performance of a lost soul. When a girl asks him, "What are you rebelling against?" and he answers, "What do you got?" the line produced not fear, but identification in the generation that heard it. The film's specific cultural damage was not that it made motorcycle riders look dangerous. It was that it made motorcycle riders look like a coherent cultural category with shared values and shared aesthetics that were opposed to mainstream American life. Before The Wild One, motorcycle riders were working men who rode for practical and recreational reasons. After The Wild One, motorcycle riders were rebels. The industry understood what had happened before most of the culture did. Leather jacket sales increased significantly in the years following the film's release. The specific style of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, the peaked cap, the leather jacket, the dungarees, became costume before it became culture. Men who had never ridden a motorcycle bought the jacket because Brando had worn it. I personally think that transition from practical garment to cultural costume is the moment when the motorcycle industry lost the culture it had been building for 50 years. Not because the jacket was wrong, because the jacket became more important than the machine. The symbol replaced the substance, and the people who came to motorcycling for the symbol rather than the substance changed what motorcycling was. Here's what the mainstream motorcycle culture of the 1950s looked like while Hollywood was constructing the outlaw myth. These two things existed simultaneously, and the documentary record of one was vastly more prominent than the documentary record of the other. The American Motorcyclists Association had approximately 100,000 registered members in the early 1950s. These were dues-paying members of sanctioned clubs who participated in organized events, gypsy tours, hill climbs, flat track racing, endurance events, and field meets. The association calendar for any given year in the early 1950s shows dozens of events across the country, organized by clubs with names like the Fresno Motorcycle Club, the Denver Motorcycle Club, the Chicago Motorcycle Club. Family events, summer weekends, American civic life, organized around a machine, family. Women competed. At a time when women's athletic participation was actively discouraged by most American institutions, motorcycle competition provided a specific exception. The women's division of flat track racing, sanctioned by the American Motorcyclists Association in the 1950s, was active and legitimate. Dorothy Dot Robinson, the most decorated female motorcycle competitor in American history, up to that point, won over 200 endurance events and rally competitions. She won the Jack Pine Enduro, one of the most demanding motorcycle endurance events in America, multiple times competing against men. Life magazine photographed her in 1948 as a housewife who happened to be America's greatest woman motorcycle competitor. The headline treated her as a curiosity. She was not a curiosity. She was the product of a culture that had been building female competition infrastructure for 30 years. The black motorcycle community rode too. The East Bay Dragons Motorcycle Club was founded in Oakland in 1959. Toby Jean Livingston, the founder, grew up in Oakland and started riding in the 1950s when the American Motorcyclists Association still had a whites-only membership policy. The black motorcycle clubs that formed in the 1950s and early 1960s in Oakland and Los Angeles, in Detroit, and in Chicago developed an entirely parallel culture to the mainstream because the mainstream culture's governing institution formally excluded them. They built their own events, their own runs, and their own community infrastructure. The mainstream motorcycle press did not cover any of it. The History Lounge did not cover any of it. This channel is one of the few places this part of the story has been told. The Korean War veterans arrived home in the early 1950s the same way the World War II veterans had arrived in the late 1940s, changed by what they had experienced, in need of a community that understood that change, and finding it on two wheels. The motorcycle clubs that formed around Korean War veterans in the early 1950s were structurally identical to the clubs formed by World War II veterans 5 years earlier. Working class men, practical machines, community organized around shared experience. Working class. The booze fighters, whose presence at Hollister had contributed to the incident that Life magazine mythologized, were a specific case in point. The club was founded in 1946 by Wino Willie Faulkner, a World War II veteran, at the All-American Bar in South Central Los Angeles. The name was a joke. The founder was not a violent man. He was a veteran who liked to ride and liked to drink and thought it was funny to name a club after both habits. The booze fighters participated in events sanctioned by the American Motorcyclists Association. They entered sanctioned competitions. When the Hollister incident produced the Life magazine photograph, the booze fighters were specifically mischaracterized as the primary source of disorder. The historical record does not support that characterization. Faulkner himself said so repeatedly in interviews before his death. After Hollister and after the Wild One, the American Motorcyclists Association, known as AMA, issued a statement that produced more lasting cultural damage than either the photograph or the film. The trouble at Hollister was caused by the 1% of motorcyclists who are outlaws and undesirables. The other 99% are good, decent, law-abiding citizens. The AMA has never confirmed that this statement was actually issued in this exact form. Multiple scholars who have researched the organization's historical records have been unable to locate the original document. The statement may be an apocryphal distillation of positions the AMA took in the aftermath of Hollister. It may be the editorial summary of a press release that did not survive. It may have been invented entirely and retroactively attributed to the AMA because it was a useful organizing statement for the culture that followed. What the statement produced was the 1% identity. The clubs that rejected the AMA's framing, that rejected the 99% designation, and the implication that compliance with mainstream values was the measure of a legitimate rider, began wearing 1% patches as a declaration of identity. The Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Pagans, the Banditos. The four clubs that would eventually become the Big Four of outlaw motorcycle culture all adopted the 1% identity not as an admission of criminality, but as a rejection of the AMA's authority to define what a legitimate rider is. The specific irony of this moment is worth sitting with. The AMA, attempting to distance legitimate motorcycle culture from the outlaw myth that Hollywood and Life magazine had constructed, issued a statement that gave the outlaw myth its most enduring symbol. The 1% patch exists because the AMA tried to create a clean distinction between good riders and bad riders. The distinction backfired in the most complete way imaginable. By the mid-1950s, the outlaw biker was a fixed cultural archetype, not because the culture that produced it was large. In 1955, the total membership of all clubs that would eventually be classified as 1% organizations was a few thousand people at most, against an AMA membership of 100,000 and a broader motorcycle riding population of several hundred thousand. The outlaw culture was a fringe. Hollywood made it the center. Stop here for a moment. Think about the rider who taught you to ride, or the person who first put you on a motorcycle, or the club you rode with for 20 years that the mainstream culture never understood. This video is the document they deserve. Share it to the Facebook group where your riding community lives. Post it to our motorcycles on Reddit. Post it to our vintage motorcycles. Send it to the person who has been riding for 40 years and would recognize every single thing we are talking about. The algorithm shows this video to more people every time someone shares it outside YouTube. You sharing it right now is the most direct way to make sure this history reaches the people who need it. While Hollywood was constructing and reconstructing the outlaw biker identity through the 1950s, an entirely different motorcycle culture was developing that no film has ever properly documented, and that most people, even most motorcyclists, know almost nothing about: the desert racers. The off-road community that emerged from the southwestern United States in the late 1940s and developed through the 1950s into the most technically demanding motorcycle culture America has ever produced. The terrain of the Mojave Desert does not forgive incompetence. The arroyos and dry lake beds and Rocky Mountain passes of the California and Nevada desert produced riding conditions that required a specific kind of machine, light, reliable, capable of handling terrain that would destroy a road bike, and a specific kind of rider. The desert racer of the 1950s was not performing an identity. He was solving a problem. The problem was how to cover desert terrain at speed without dying. The solution was mechanical knowledge, physical fitness, riding skill developed over thousands of miles, and a machine that he had likely built or significantly modified himself. The Big Bear Run, the Greenhorn Enduro, the Catalina Grand Prix, run on Catalina Island. These were the events that defined American off-road motorcycle competition in the 1950s. The riders who competed in them, men like Bud Ekins, who would later serve as Steve McQueen's stunt double in The Great Escape, and Malcolm Smith, who would become the protagonist of Bruce Brown's On Any Sunday, were the most skilled motorcycle riders in America. None of them were outlaws. None of them appeared in the popular press as examples of motorcycle culture. Hollywood had defined what motorcycle culture looked like, and it looked like Marlon Brando in a leather jacket, not Bud Ekins in a dust-covered jersey finishing a 200-mile desert race. Steve McQueen himself is worth discussing specifically. McQueen started riding motorcycles in the early 1950s. He competed in enduros. He raced the 6 Days Trial in 1964 as part of the United States team. He won a silver medal at the International 6 Days Trial in 1964. He was, by the objective standard of competition results, one of the most accomplished motorcycle racers America produced in that era. What Hollywood made him famous for was not his racing, it was The Great Escape, in which he rode a Triumph TR6 trophy motorcycle through a scene that his own skill as a rider made possible. The motorcycle jumping the barbed wire fence is the image people remember. McQueen drove the fence side himself. Bud Ekins, his friend and fellow desert racer, drove the Allied side because the production insurance would not allow McQueen to take both risks. The most famous motorcycle scene in Hollywood history was made possible by the desert racing culture that Hollywood had spent a decade ignoring. The men who could do what that scene required were the men the popular culture had been looking past to focus on the staged photograph and the theatrical myth. This is the part of the story I find hardest to understand when I look at what the culture became. The 1950s motorcycle culture had women in it, not as accessories, not as passengers, as riders, as competitors, as the people who organized the events that made the culture what it was. The specific erasure of those women from the popular history of motorcycling is one of the most complete acts of historical revision I have encountered researching this channel. Dot Robinson. Already mentioned. But the full picture of who she was requires more than one sentence. She competed in the Jack Pine Enduro, a 500-mile, 2-day endurance event through Michigan forest roads in all weather. And she won it against mixed fields. She did not win a women apostrophes division. She won the event against men who had been riding their entire lives. She did that in the early 1950s when the AMA apostrophe S official position was that women should be encouraged to ride as passengers. Linda Dugeau, the co-founder of the Motor Maids, the oldest all-women motorcycle organization in America, established in 1940. Dugeau rode a motorcycle from Providence, Rhode Island to San Jose, California to meet Dot Robinson at an AMA event in 1940. They decided that women who rode motorcycles needed an organization that recognized them as riders rather than as passengers of male riders. The Motor Maids were that organization. By the mid-1950s, the Motor Maids had chapters across the country, and their membership competed in AMA events at every level. The mainstream motorcycle press of the 1950s covered these women occasionally, always framed as curiosity, the exception rather than the norm, the woman who rides rather than the rider who happens to be a woman. The film The Wild One had no women riders. The outlaw biker films that followed The Wild One through the late 1950s and the 1960s featured women only as objects of threat or rescue. That absence helped build an outlaw image that excluded women from the center of the story. The culture that had produced Dot Robinson and the Motor Maids and the Van Buren sisters was replaced in the popular imagination by a culture in which women existed only in relation to men on motorcycles. That replacement did not happen because the culture changed. It happened because the camera pointed somewhere else. The motorcycle of the early 1950s, before the Japanese manufacturers arrived to fundamentally change what a motorcycle could be, was a machine that demanded complete engagement from its rider. The Harley-Davidson Panhead was introduced in 1948. It was named for the shape of the rocker covers, which resembled upside-down roasting pans. It replaced the knucklehead that had defined the preceding decade. The Panhead was a 74 cubic inch overhead valve V-twin that produced approximately 50 horsepower in its standard form. It had hydraulic lifters, a significant reliability improvement over the knucklehead's mechanical lifters. It had an aluminum cylinder head that dissipated heat more effectively than the cast iron head it replaced. It still leaked oil. It still required regular valve adjustments. It still needed its primary chain tensioned, its points set, its ignition timing checked, and its carburetor jetted for the altitude and temperature at which it was going to be ridden. A rider who owned a Panhead in 1952 was a mechanic. He had to be. The nearest dealer might be 50 miles away. The machine broke in ways that required immediate roadside intervention or a long walk to the nearest telephone. The Indian Chief was the last great Indian motorcycle before the company collapsed in 1953. It had skirted fenders and a 74 cubic inch flathead V-twin that made less power than the Panhead, but delivered torque that pulled the machine through terrain that would have stopped a smaller engine. The Indian rider of the early 1950s belonged to a culture that was ending even as he participated in it. By 1953, the factory was gone, the dealers were closing, and the parts supply was becoming problematic. The men who had been riding Indians since the 1930s were facing the particular grief of watching a machine they loved become impossible to maintain because the company that made it had ceased to exist. The British bikes. The Triumph Bonneville would not arrive until 1959, but through the early and mid-1950s, the Triumph Speed Twin and the Tiger were the machines American riders chose when they wanted lighter handling and a higher revving character rather than the American iron. Triumph dealers who had established themselves in the 1940s were building customer bases that would sustain the brand through its peak decades. The BSA Gold Star, a single-cylinder racing machine that became the most successful production race bike in Britain, began to appear on American tracks and endurance events in the early 1950s, ridden by men who found in the British machine what the American iron could not provide. This was a machine culture in the early 1950s. Specific machines, specific requirements, specific knowledge. A rider who knew his machine completely because the machine demanded to be known completely. The mechanic culture, the wrench culture, the man on Saturday morning with his hands inside a Panhead engine making the adjustment that would determine how the machine ran on Sunday. Hollywood replaced that with a leather jacket and an attitude. The jacket was easier to sell than the knowledge.